Signore e signori, buonasera. Thank you for being with us here at Casa Italiana zerilli-marimò for this event co-organized with the Centro Primo Levi, New York, and with the Agincourt Press. And you're going to find out a little bit more about this. I couldn't think of a better way to spend the pre-electoral evening than going to look the soothing power of poetry that we hope we're going to experiment tonight. And Fosco said, poesia rasserenatrice. Professor Ballerini, how would you translate poesia rasserenatrice? He would not. And very, very wisely so. Let's hope that that's the function. We are here to talk about a great Italian author that probably all of you know as a novelist. And his novel, The Garden of the Finzi-Continis, as you all know, is what really caused his personality to explode also in the American scene. He was invited here in many universities. That's what gave him popularity. And of course, the film based on the book, a film that he rejected very bitterly after it came out, but still that gave a lot of fame and reputation to Giorgio Bassani. Less known is his poetry, and that's the reason why we're here tonight. We wanted to listen to Bassani's other voice in English. And I would like to congratulate Roberta, Antognini, and Peter Robinson for having decided to translate these collection of poems and to make them available to the English-speaking public. Tonight here we have to present with me our guest and this initiative, Professor Luigi Ballerini, as I refer to him, my venerable predecessor as the founder and establisher of this cultural center and all the things that happen here, and also somebody that is in his right a very important poet, but also, unlike many other poets, he's a generous poet because he also promotes the poetry of other people. And I would say he spent a good part of his life promoting American poetry, Italian poetry, the meeting of different poetic traditions, and he's still working very hard on all these fronts, especially with the Agincourt Press, that is his brainchild, that is connected with University of Toronto Press, and in this collection, in this library, Professor Ballerini translates, I would say every year, he brings to life one or two Italian classics that have been either forgotten, never translated, poorly translated, partially translated, and gives them new life. This is part of the kind of initiatives that he does. And our guests tonight are Roberta Antognini, and is very connected with Professor Ballerini. Roberta hails from the Canton Ticino in Switzerland, the Italian-speaking part of Switzerland, where she went back residing recently. But she has a degree from the Catholic University of Milan and a PhD from New York University, where she happened to have studied with Professor Ballerini. And she went on, and she just retired a short time ago from Vassar College. She had Professor Emerita of Italian Literature, with a strong interest in contemporary literature, even if she studied Petrarch and wrote about it and many other things. And with her tonight is also Peter Robinson, who hails from Reading University, where he teaches English and American literature. So we have a great panel, and I would like to invite Professor Ballerini to come to the stage and greet you and tell us something about this endeavor. Thank you.
Thank you. There's no way I can convince Stefano to sort of write down the introduction when it comes to me, but of course I appreciate every word he says anyway. So, well, I've been in the publishing business for a while, in fact, all my life. And the Agincourt Press is, I believe, the third attempt to get Italian culture meet American culture in this country. Prior, we had the Out of London Press, then the Marsilio, USA, and finally Agincourt Press. Agincourt operates along three different lines. One is the Lorenzo da Ponte Italian Library, which we do in cooperation with the University of Toronto Press, as Stefano indicated, for classics, like sort of revolutionary classics, for like Giordano Bruno, not in the run-of-the-mill. But also Opuntia, this series of books that put together new voices and established voices, provided that the established voices, provided that they are like airplane, jet airplane. You know, you push back in order to go forward. So we mix established poets that give us energy to move on. And of course, Giorgio Bassani fits the bill very well. We're also publishing established critics of Italian literature that have the same effect, like Gianfranco Contini, and we're about to publish also the poetry written in Friulian dialect by Pasolini. Now that's kind of difficult because it will be a trilingual book, Friulian, Italian, and English. And but there is something Pasolini and Bassani have very little in common, but they have one very important common trait: the epigram. They really are fierce in attacking through epigrams their enemies or their mediocrity and sins of society and so on and so forth. So I think, in fact, one of the books included here is Epitaph, which is, it's completely made up of epigrams. And as I said in my notes, and before I forget, yes, it's there, I'd like to give you a sample of this powerful epigrammatic drive that characterizes Bassani's poetry, and a man who, as the Italians say, non aveva peli sulla lingua, he did not let hair grow on his tongue. That's a place where usually hair doesn't grow, but I don't know why we say that, but in fact it means that you can say exactly what you think in front of anyone, regardless of the consequences. And now here is a sample of that. It's called To a Critic, a un critico. I would read it in Italian because it's really sensational. Which also reminds me that poetry has no soothing effect at all. It should be very disturbing. And it should engage the reader. It's no Sunday trip, it's really, it's by far more engaging than just recognizing the words or identifying with the author. Se la poesia deve essere ormai, come tu dici, considerata né più né meno di un semplice strumento di comunicazione, uguale a tantissimi altri, ebbene sia. Comunicare tramite l'arte, del resto, fu ognora la mia ambizione suprema. Pur se non giunsi mai, e poi mai, a sperare di riuscirci, persino con te, coglione. If poetry by now must be, as you say, considered more or less a simple communicational tool, equal to a great many others, so be it. Communicating by means of art was, after all, always my supreme ambition, even if I never, ever went as far as hoping to achieve even it with you, coglione. Now, coglione is an interesting word. Did you know that Queen Margaret in Henry VI, Part 2, Act 1, Scene 3, expostulates as follows. And as for you that love to be protected under the wings of our protector's grace, begin your suits anew, and sue to him. Away, base colliers. Thank you very much.
Buonasera. Buonasera. Volevo ringraziare prima di tutto, in English. I wanted to thank above all Casa Zerilli-Marimò and Stefano Albertini and the Centro Primo Levi, Alessandro Cassin for inviting us to present our book. And of course, we wanted to thank Luigi Ballerini, our publisher, to believe in poetry, and also Fondazione Bassani with its president Paola Bassani, that unfortunately cannot be here with us tonight. And of course, thank you to all to be here. Even though Giorgio Bassani is most known as a novelist, not only in this country but also in Italy, he liked to consider himself above all a poet. And he wasn't a prolific author. During his lifetime, he published 4 novels and 3 collections of short stories. Except for his first collection that he published very early in 1945 with a pseudonym because of the Italian racial laws, he published his novels and short stories between 1956 and 1972. A couple of years later, he collected his prose production into one book called The Romanzo di Ferrara, the novel of Ferrara. So before 1956, Bassani had published only poems and 3 collections of poems. And after 1972, he published 2 more collections of poems. And later on, he collected all his poems in one book by the title In Rima e Senza, which are the collected poems here. The division between his first production and his second production is in the title, In Rima and Senza, in rhyme and without, and is striking. They belong to the different Bassani, both in time and in his literary production. Later we will briefly talk how producing a poetic oeuvre into such different contrasting styles, presents a challenge for its translators. So now we will read 3 poems from each section, and Peter will read from In Rima, and I will read from Senza. Wait.
Well, in fact, obviously we're going to read both in English and Italian, and we're going to alternate between English and Italian, not always reading the Italian first, but swapping between the two. So sometimes you'll hear the translation first, sometimes you'll hear the Italian original first. The first one we're going to read, it's the first for me in a number of ways. It's the first for Bassani in the sense that it's the first time in any of his texts that he mentions the word Ferrara, his hometown. And it's the first, for me, it's the first poem of his I ever attempted to translate, I think in about 1979. It's called Verso Ferrara, but I'll read you the translation first, which is Towards Ferrara. It's at this hour through endless warm grasses, towards Ferrara the last trains run, with slow whistles they greet the evening, indolently drown in sleep, slowly snuffing red turreted churches. From open windows the meadow's ferment faintly enters to veil the shine of poor benches. It loosens weary fingers of poor lovers in singlets, renders the parched lips empty of kisses.
Verso Ferrara. È a quest'ora che vanno per calde erbe infinite verso Ferrara gli ultimi treni. Con fischi lenti salutano la sera, affondano indolenti nel sonno che via via là spegne pievi rosse turrite. Dai finestrini aperti l'alcol delle marcite entra un po' a velare il lustro delle povere panche. Dei poveri amanti in maglia scioglie le dita stanche, fa deserte di baci, le labbra inaridite.
So that poem was written in, sounds like the summer of 1942. Bassani was traveling regularly since having studied at the University of Bologna with Roberto Longhi. And this journey between Ferrara and Bologna is very, very important for him. And one of the key scenes in his first novel, The Gold-Rimmed Spectacles, is also set exactly on this train journey. In May of 1943, the following year, he was arrested for anti-fascist activity and imprisoned in Ferrara. And he wrote a number of individual poems about that, but also his second book was called Te Lucis Ante, and that's a sequence of poems all about his imprisonment in Ferrara in 1943. He was released, or he managed to get out in July of 1943 at the time of the fall of Mussolini, and then managed to marry and to get to Rome through the Allied lines, where, well, we'll come to Rome in a moment. But here's one of those poems, which is called Dal carcere, from prison, and Roberta is going to read the Italian first.
Dal carcere. Dalle torri di Ferrara vola ormai la dolce luce, ma una grata, nera, avara, chi ti volge, chi ti induce, o carezza della sera? Chi risponde a una preghiera, ad un pianto abbandonato con questa esile fanfara? Oh, non cada sera, alcuna notte mai, se non vi porti per lo spazio o per la bruna, suoni deboli e distorti, rari trepidi segnali, quando le ore son più uguali, quando più lontano è il giorno e ogni grido è sopra il mare.
From prison. From the towers of Ferrara, by now the soft light flies, but from a mean black grating, who turns you, who leads you, O caress of evening? Who replies to a prayer, to an abandoned keening, with this slender fanfare? Oh, don't let dusk fall, nor night ever, if it doesn't bring you through space, through the mist, sounds weak and distorted, rare, anxious signals, when hours are more of the same, when the day is much further, and every cry over the sea. So, as I say, Bassani was able to get through the Italian, with his wife, to get through the lines to Rome in late 1943, and he more or less based himself there and lived there for much of the rest of his professional life. And the third of these poems that we're going to read is called Saluto a Roma. So it's a poem in which he kind of says goodbye to Rome and thinks about traveling back to his hometown. In fact, Ferrara, as Roberta said, is the central focus, rather like James Joyce's Dublin. It's the central focus for all of Bassani's fiction. And yet he wrote it all in Rome, where he worked as an editor for much of his life. So I think this time I'm reading the English first. So this is called Salute to Rome. Goodbye, limed arena, goodbye, diamond. Your sky is a closed face above me. Let me return to my hometown buried in grass as in a warm and heavy sea. Burning gates in the distant sky, your sun is black, it's black your moon. Flesh without regret, laughter without one memory, hopeless city, goodbye. For I know your streets, straight swords, and sounds of your celestial squares, but I know the gales that hone you, the wails from your hidden stations.
Saluto a Roma.
No, your brow doesn't shine with grace. Who'll gather you, cry of jubilation? The rainbow mirroring you is cloudless. You're alone within your walls of space.
It's not completely my fault. It's divided, you know.
Yeah, no, I'm very bad at turning pages.
Saluto a Roma. Addio arena di calce, addio diamante, il tuo cielo su me è un chiuso volto. Lascia che io torni al mio paese sepolto nell'erba come in un mare caldo e pesante. Porte roventi nel cielo distante, nero è il tuo sole, nera la tua luna. Carne senza rimpianti, riso senza nessuna memoria, addio città senza speranza. Perché io so le tue vie, dritte spade, i suoni delle tue piazze celesti, ma so il vento che ti affila, il lamento delle tue nascoste stazioni. No, la tua fronte non splende di grazia, chi ti raccoglierà a grido di giubilo? l'iride che ti specchia è senza nubi, sei sola dentro le tue mura di spazio.
So these are the three poems we're going to present. We've presented from the earlier part of his career, the in rima, the rhymed poems. He'd published all of these by, I think, 1952. And now we're going to turn, Roberta's going to introduce them, we're going to turn to the later poetry, which is extraordinarily different.
Yes, as you can see, these are traditionally, positioned in the left of the page, and then this is Rolls-Royce, and this is from the collection called Epitaph, and is one of the longest poems. We chose expressly one of the longest poems just to show you its narrative quality. And those are all in the center of the page. They are all unrhymed and unpunctuated, and have a conversational tone of sort. It's not an experimenting language, but is a kind of prose writing. Still has is a difficult prose, because the syntax is always very complex. Even though, as you have heard from Luigi, sometimes the lexicon is quite hard, and difficult, and very colloquial sometimes. So this is from Epitaph, and the poem here is this is one of his most famous poems, and Bassani loved to read it. And if you go on YouTube, you can find Bassani reading this poem, and I'll try to do the same way he did. I don't know if I can. And the poet is retelling a dream, and he is driven by a chauffeur through Ferrara, through the streets of his town as a young person, and he meets places and also characters from his youth. As we say, Bassani lived in Ferrara until 1943, and basically all of his literary production is based in Ferrara, and his poems are always looking back, always. He's looking back to the city and of his youth. So let me...
So Roberta's going to read the Italian first.
Yeah, I'm going to divide the poem because it was too small, but just to give you an idea how long it was all together. Rolls-Royce. Subito dopo aver chiuso gli occhi per sempre, eccomi ancora una volta, chissà come, a riattraversare Ferrara in macchina. Una grossa berlina metallizzata di marca straniera dai grandi cupi cristalli, forse una Rolls. A scendere ancora una volta dal castello Estense, giù, percorso Giovecca verso il roseo ghirigoro terminale della prospettiva che intanto piano piano si faceva grande entro il concavo rettangolo del parabrise. Lo chauffeur d'alta e dura collottola seduto a dritta davanti certo lo sapeva molto bene da che parte dirigersi, né io d'altronde mi sognavo minimamente di rammentarglielo, ansioso com'ero di riconoscere sulla sinistra la chiesa di San Carlo, più in là a destra quella dei Teatini, a lei di contro già fermi così di buon'ora in crocchio sul marciapiede dinanzi alla pasticceria Folchini, gli amici di mio padre quando lui era giovane, i più con larghe lobbie bigie in capo, alcuni con tanto di mazza dal pomo d'argento in pugno, ansioso, anzi smagnoso com'ero, insomma, di ripercorrere l'intera Main Street della mia città in un giorno qualsiasi di maggio, giugno, attorno alla metà degli anni 20, un quarto d'ora avanti le 9 di mattina. Quasi sospinta dal suo stesso soffio luzzuoso, infine, la Rolls svoltava laggiù per via Madama e di lì a poco in via Cesterna del Follo, e a questo punto ero io non più che decenne, le guance di fuoco per il timore d'arrivar tardi a scuola, a uscire in quel preciso istante coi libri sotto braccio dal portone numero 1. Ero io che, pur continuando a correre, mi giravo indietro verso la mamma spenzolata dalla finestra di sopra a raccomandarmi qualcosa. Ero io, proprio io, che un attimo prima di sparire alla vista di lei, ragazza, dietro l'angolo levavo il braccio sinistro in un gesto di insofferenza insieme d'addio, avrei voluto gridare alt al rigido chauffeur e scendere, ma la Rolls, sobbalzando mollemente già, lungheggiava il montagnone, anzi ormai fuori porta già volava per strade ampie e deserte, prive affatto di tetti ai lati e affatto sconosciute.
Bravo. Ecco l'inglese. Rolls Royce. Straight after closing my eyes forever, here I am, who knows how, crossing Ferrara by car once more. A huge metallized foreign-made sedan with great dark windows, perhaps a Rolls, descending once more from the Este Castle down by Corso Giovecca towards the Prospettiva's final rose-colored squiggle, which was slowly but surely growing big in the concave rectangle of the windscreen. The chauffeur with high stiff collar sat on the right in front. He knew the way to take for sure, nor did I ever dream for a moment of reminding him, anxious as I was to recognize the church of San Carlo on the left and the Teatini further to the right, already standing in a group on the pavement before it so early in front of the Pasticceria Folchini, my father's friends when he was young, most with wide grey lobia hats on their heads, some even with silver-knobbed canes in their fists, above all anxious, desirous rather as I was, to cross the entire main street of my hometown in an any day of May or June around the middle of the 20s at 8:45 in the morning. Almost driven along by its own luxurious breath, the Rolls at last would turn down by Via Madama and a little way on into Via Cisterna del Follo, and by this point myself I was no more than 10, cheeks burning from the fear of being late for school, coming out at that precise instant, books under my arm from the front door at number 1. It was me who, as I went on running, would turn around towards Mother leaning out of the window above to remind me of something. It was me, really me, who a moment before disappearing round the corner, seeing her girlish figure, would raise my left arm in a gesture of impatience and at the same time, goodbye. I'd have wanted to shout stop to the rigid chauffeur and get down from the Rolls, bouncing softly already, sidled down the Montagnone, actually by now out of town, already flying through wide empty streets, lacking roofs entirely to the sides and entirely unknown. Thank you. Thank you very much.
And the next two are shorter. This is another poem from Epitaph, and so Rolls-Royce was above all about places, but this poem is about people. Often stars of these poems are the immediate and extended family of Bassani. Here is his cousin Giacomo to take the stage, and I think you read English first.
Oh, yeah, okay. So this is called I Arrive, My Mother's Not Well. I arrive, my mother's not well. I phone my cousin, the doctor, immediately, ready to declare himself in pajamas. I take the car, I drive. And he's right there, downstairs, already waiting, in a tie before the threshold of that rosy, all-fancied up, antiquated mansion of his. What the hell to tell each other after nearly 30 years? That we don't spend much time together? Nothing too demanding, too intimate, of course, and that way during the short journey from home to home we say barely a thing. I notice, however, looking at him from the corner of my eye, how in a quarter century he's come to look incredibly like my father, he too a doctor, but in his spare time, a family one. He has the same, I tell myself, fragile cheekbones, the same thin, tired, faintly purple, neurotic lips, the same yellowish cartilage, uses just the same identical, patient, submissive Jewish irony. In the meantime, he insists on guiding me from lane to lane in the dark with the slightly mocking sweetness of a citizen piloting by chance the illustrious foreign guest. The sweetness, too, of an old chap who welcomes the nearly equally old, or maybe one who dead a much longer time does so for the recently.
Arrivo, mia madre non sta bene. Arrivo, mia madre non sta bene, telefono al cugino medico, subito pronto a dichiararsi in pigiama, prendo la macchina, vado ed eccolo là, sotto, giusto da basso, che già m'aspetta in cravatta dinanzi alla soglia del roseo tutto pimpante suo vetusto palazzotto. Che cosa diavolo dirci dopo quasi 30 anni che non si sta un po' assieme? Nulla di impegnativo, di troppo intimo naturalmente, e così durante il breve tragitto da casa a casa non ci diciamo pressoché niente. Mi accorgo però guardandolo di sottecchi come in un quarto di secolo ce l'abbia fatta a incredibilmente assomigliare a mio padre, anche lui medico, ma a tempo perso, curante. Possiede gli stessi, mi dico, fragili zigomi, le stesse sottili, stanche, un po' viola, labbra nevrotiche, le medesime cartilagine gialline, adopera l'uguale identica paziente, sommessa, ironia ebraica. Insiste frattanto a guidarmi di stradetta in stradetta nel buio con la dolcezza un tantino beffarda del cittadino trovatosi a pilotare per caso l'illustre ospite forestiero, la dolcezza anche del vecchio che accoglie il quasi vecchio altrettanto, o magari di chi, defunto d'assai più lungo tempo, l'ha appena. Allora, this one is one of the poems from the second collection of the In Great Secret, and the original of this poem was Dal Michigan, from Michigan, and it is a poem from 1976. It's interesting, there are a few poems in this second collection that Bassani wrote in this country. In 1976, when he wrote this poem, is actually, Bassani is for 2 days in March in Detroit, where he was invited by the Wayne State University for a conference and to read some of his poems. That year, Bassani is teaching at Indiana University in Bloomington, where he was invited by Edoardo Lebano there to teach. Actually, he taught himself his novels. And from that, always in that same year, from October to the end of the year, he will be in Berkeley. And that year, he was also in New York, where he was already here many, many times. And to give you an idea of how many times he came to New York, he came here the first time in 1966, then in 1972 he comes here 4 times. He's invited to talk at the Italian Cultural Institute at Columbia University, and then he comes back in 74, 75, 76, 77, 80, 81, and 86. I think we can give him, honorary citizenship for how many times he came to this town. And these and many other details about Bassani's experience in North America will be dealt by my friend and colleague Valerio Capozzo in a book called Postcards from North America that will be out next year by Olsky, published in Florence. So I think, who goes first? Me. Me. Per lettera. Come è sempre bravo il cuore Nini, come non sbaglia mai. Stamattina in Detroit di ferro lungo la così chiamata Cass mentre arrancavo via controvento in fretta nella dura, gelida luce di qua. Lui m'è sfuggito a un tratto a sinistra dentro un vicolo laterale, ma che dico un vicolo? Dentro una pura fessura da sorci ed amici e da cicche, mezza al buio, fra due nere muraglie a strapiombo, e di laggiù, proprio di laggiù, dal fondo d'una qualsiasi povera penombra senza nome, al fine ce l'ha pur fatta a ritrovarti.
So by letter. How it's always good, the heart, darling. How it's never wrong this morning in iron Detroit along the so-called Cass, while I trudged off against the wind in a hurry in the hard, icy light hereabouts. How it suddenly escaped to the left into an alley, to the side. But what am I saying, an alley? Into a pure crack for mice and cats and butts, half in darkness between two black overhanging walls. And from down there, right down there, from the bottom of some nameless poor penumbra, it was even able to find you at last. Okay. Thank you very much. That's the poetry reading part of the evening. And so what we're now planning to do is we're going to move the chairs a bit closer together, so we're not playing tennis, and we'll try and we're going to have a little conversation.
So the question is, Peter, why do we decided to translate Bassani poems? And of course
we have two different reasons, I think, don't we? So maybe if you could start with your reason, then I'll give my reason.
Yeah, so I think, of course, you know, the idea was to give the access to anglophone readers to Bassani's poetry as well. They do have access to Bassani's prose. Actually, Bassani was translated very early in this country. His first novel appeared in 1958, Gli occhiali d'oro, and 2 years later, in 1960, Isabel Quigley translated it, and the book came out both in Great Britain and in United States. And then Isabel Quigley went on translating also the Storie Ferraresi, A Prospect of Ferrara. Then in 1962 Il Giardino dei Finzi-Contini, The Garden of the Finzi-Contini, came out in Italy in 1962 and was published here in 1965. And actually the book was the book which cemented the international reputation of Bassani, and also was discovered by an American audience thanks to Vittorio De Sica's Oscar-winning film of 1970. Later on, William Weaver, the great William Weaver, except for Gli occhiali d'oro, translated all of Bassani's narrative, all of his prose, all of his novels and short stories. And then the widely accepted centrality of Bassani's fiction was recently being underlined by the publication in 2018 of the Romanzo di Ferrara, finally collecting even in English, all of Bassani prose the way he wanted to. So,
as Roberta is saying here, Bassani's prose is widely recognized, multiply translated by Isabel Quigley, William Weaver, and then Jamie also McKendrick.
Jamie McKendrick lately.
And
forgot to say that.
On the other hand, if you were looking around for Bassani's poetry, it was very hard to find. I mean, I was at university in 1971. I went to university in 1971, and while there in New York, the Garden of the Finzi-Continis actually appeared on the kind of the university film club. So I went along and saw it. So I had this idea of vaguely who Giorgio Bassani was, and that he'd written this. That he was the author of this book. But I didn't read the book. I just watched the film and went home. But then, when studying for my PhD in Cambridge, I came across. I was one of my authors was a British poet called Donald Davy, who taught at Stanford for a very long time and then at Vanderbilt. And in his Los Angeles poems volume, there are 2 translations. Well, no, one of them's a translation of Idyll from one of Bassani's early poems, and then there's also a kind of adaptation of another one. And so I saw, and it's underneath it says, after Giorgio Bassani. So this was how I discovered that he was a poet at all, and I went searching for the poems in the University Library in Cambridge, and I couldn't find them. I found it very, very difficult to find any translations at all. I managed to track down William Weaver's very early ones. As soon as he started translating prose, he gave up on poetry altogether, I think. And so I tried to translate. Occasionally I would come across 1 or 2 of these early poems in anthologies and would translate them. But then what happened is that remembering them, I was in Norfolk on holiday, visiting a friend of ours who I'm very pleased to say is here tonight. And it was a very inspiring kind of visit. And I started writing some poems of my own about it, and the influence, the inspiration of Bassani's early poetry came back to me. And I thought, I can use this way of writing poems as a way to sort of channel all this material that was kind of flooding in. And once I'd done that and got it ready for publication, I felt kind of a mixture of gratitude and guilt, because I'd sort of really just exploited these poems of Bassani's for my own purposes. So I thought I should try to translate them all. Also, all the early ones, realizing that, in fact, his centenary was coming up. The centenary of his birth was coming up. So, and we actually did a little presentation about Bassani on the centenary at a poetry festival in Reading in 2016. So there I got this manuscript of all of the early poetry, which frankly nobody was making a big noise about wanting to publish. I managed to publish a few things in magazines here, and very, very obscure magazines here and there, at which point I think I'm going to turn over to Roberta to tell the next bit of the story.
Yeah, they were so obscure that for a long, long time, Paola Bassani and I actually were looking for finding someone to translate Bassani's poems, and for many years we didn't seem like to find anyone. And so I decided one day that I could at least see how many translations there were, how many, except for Weaver, that translated very, very early poems, did a kind of a good job. He actually learned Italian by translating Bassani. And so I started to to look for all those translations, and I found a few, and then I found his translations, but some of them were I couldn't find them on the internet, so and nowhere, and it was very difficult. So I contacted him, sent him an email.
So I got out of the blue. I received this email from a professor in Vasa saying, could I send the translations to her, which I think I answered immediately and sent the translations, and I'm not quite sure what the next stage was, but basically we kind of exchanged the idea that we might do some translating.
Yes.
The combination of Paola wanting it all translated, and I'd done this version of the early ones, so there seemed to be a kind of coming together of things.
Yeah, and also since Paola Bassani wanted, to find someone to translate, at the time I wasn't interested in translation. And then actually as a foreigner in this country and also a teacher of Italian language and literature, my translating from one language to the other was my constant occupation and preoccupation. So I decided to make the elephant in the room stand out, and I just decided to teach a course on literary translation to my students at Vassar. And the problem was, though, that we had to translate from Italian to English, because they couldn't do the opposite, and so we found ourselves in a kind of a situation where we were collaborating, and so it was extremely challenging for the both of us, I mean for my students and myself, and also very interesting because they were the one correcting my English and I was the one correcting their Italian. And then during the course I always invited a literary translator to speak about their work, and so that's when somebody asked me if I wanted to collaborate in translating, and I said yes. And so my career as a collaborator started. Actually, I do not translate because I'm not a native speaker, but as a scholar, I have some insight, and I can work on the syntax, work on the cultural differences, and so when we decided to do this work together, I was ready to.
So we met in. I had a family reason for being in Switzerland. I was visiting Zurich, and I realized that Lugano was just a couple of hours on the train away, and we arranged to meet in Zurich. We had lunch together. We discussed the pros and cons of collaborating. I collaborated on translating the poetry of Vittorio Sereni with someone which had kind of ended badly in some ways. The book came out and it's good, but the relationship was kind of strained almost to breaking point by getting the book out. And then I had a very good experience of working with Luciano Erba and his wife Mimia on translating his poetry. And that was just an entirely happy experience. So I was keen to have a happy experience of collaborating and not to have a not so happy one.
And it was a happy
experience. And we are
still
talking, as you can see.
And
so in fact we decided to try it, and the situation was that we had a draft version of the early poetry done by me, some of which had actually been published. And I'd tried a few of the later poems, which I think for reasons that you might have already seen, I found more challenging and more difficult to do. So in a sense, the work kind of split in that way, so that Roberta helped very much with producing an original draft to work on of these very long and lots of these late poems, long and varied, which I would then work on. So in that way, we did it in the kind of classic piggyback way, where you get a version of the text and then you rewrite it as much as you can, then it goes back to the other person, and after lots of backwards and forwards and conversation, we would come to a conclusion. We would sort of think we've more or less got this one. Whereas with the early poems, Roberta read them all, went through them very carefully, and picked out various errors and mistakes and slips, some of the terrible tangles of the syntax of these early poems as well, which is very difficult to follow in some cases. And in fact, we'll talk later on about just one or two of these little tricky things that we addressed. So you can see that there's a sort of division of labor here, but not just one division of labor, two different divisions of labor related to the two very different kinds of poetry that Bassani wrote.
Yes. And also, translating is a lonely job. So having a collaborator makes it much more interesting. And also long discussions, can come out of one single word. We will show it to you later.
So the other thing we had to discuss when we met in Zurich was what kind of translations we liked.
What kind of translators are we?
What kind of translators are we, yes.
So, and what to be faithful means,
Yes.
so...
I'm a big fan. I've written a book that came out in 2012. It's called Poetry in Translation, The Art of the Impossible. And it's kind of responding to Robert Frost saying that the poetry is what gets lost in translation. You can't really translate poetry.
But then you do.
Et cetera. But then everybody does, and there's tons and tons of poetry in translation. So this is where my joke about politics may be the art of the possible, but poetry translating is the art of the impossible.
Yeah, so how literal can or should be a translation in order to be also beautiful, and that this is the old and eternal,
There's a
conundrum.
horrible sexist
Or
remark about this, which I'm not even going to mention.
we have to.
Maybe I've already mentioned it, but I'm not going to say it. It's just so awful and old-fashioned. I think there's no logical reason at all, except for very specific problems, why it's not possible to be both faithful and poetic. And one of the things I'd like to say to you about being faithful is, obviously, when you're being faithful, you've got to be faithful to something that is different. You can't be faithful to something that's the same. It's true in marriage. I think it's true in poetry translating too. So being faithful, you want to get close to the original. You want to get as close to the original as you possibly can, but being faithful means being different.
Yes.
So you just have to accept that.
Yes.
That's the truth of it.
So maybe we go. No.
So we're going
Let's
to have a look at a few
we
examples.
we'll do some practical examples so that you can see what kind of translators we are. So let me go back to the first poem we read,
So this
Verso
is,
Ferrara.
yeah, so this is, as I said earlier, this is the first poem that I tried to translate back in the late 1970s or early 80s. And in my archive, there's an ink manuscript draft of this. Obviously, I could tell, I mean, my Italian was not very good in 1979. I have to admit, it's not tremendously good now. But I could tell, obviously, that it rhymes A-B-B-A, A-B-B-A. And it's two quatrains, A-B-B-A rhymed quatrains. So I thought, can I do that? And I very quickly discovered that that's incredibly, almost impossible to do. If you were to try and do that, you'd basically have to rewrite the sense to sort of imitate or, kind of fake up what you imagine Bassani is saying. So that's not my idea of how to translate. What you have to do is you have to translate the sense as best as you can and then get the original to have some of the creative and some of the feeling of being a poem. So if the experience of reading the original is the experience of reading a poem, then the translation has got to feel like the experience of reading a poem as well. You can see here that the first line ends with the word grasses, the last line ends with the word kisses. That's the best kind of thing I can do. Slow has the same, nearly the same vowel in English as drown. There was an occasion that in my earlier version I managed to get loosens, the word loosens there, I got it at the end of the line as unclenches to rhyme with benches. Not very good. But nevertheless, I was kind of trying to get it to rhyme something like the original. And there is just one example of the way in which in this case anyway, we've compromised the rhyme scheme, as it were, for the sense, is this word maglia here.
Yeah, I want to mention this.
Yeah.
Sometimes it helps. This is more a cultural translation because what did Bassani meant by maglia, and also it helps, to know. Sorry. Oh, sorry. So what Bassani meant exactly in maglia, and also it helps to know, the other works by Bassani, where these images of lovers in the grass is frequent. You keep finding it, and so that was really very difficult to render in English. And then this is Peter's job. I limit myself to say this is difficult, because I don't really understand exactly what kind of maglia is. In maglia, is that something that maybe you say in Ferrara and maybe we don't say in Lugano or in Milano. So sometimes it's just you have to also understand, not only the time when he wrote, but also, the kind of lexicon that is used.
So the problem with this word, if you were to look it up in a dictionary, as I might have done, it could tell you that it means a jersey.
Yeah.
Like in the
T-shirt.
but like in the the things that the cyclists wear the yellow one that they wear in the Tour de France. But obviously this is the summer. It's very, very hot here, as the poem's giving you this feeling of a hot summer in the Po Valley. They can't be wearing jerseys. So we had a long conversation about this, and this is why we managed to get. So we even looked it up online, I think, didn't we? to look in sort of like clothing catalogues and so on to find out whether.
No, really.
That's what they would call them. So that's where the word singlets comes from, where Italians in the summer wear these like very these kind of tops,
Peter, once upon a time translators were much more inventive because they didn't have the internet or Google Translate or reverse or anything. You had to look at catalogs, for sure.
Yeah.
So next poem is which one? Saluto a Roma.
Yeah.
That's one we read. Maybe we are only commenting on
two things. Two things on this one. There's just the first line here.
Yes, this one.
So this poem, I'm very, very sort of grateful to this poem because it's like one of my little hits, you might say. It's in the Farrar, Straus and Giroux book of 20th century Italian poetry, edited by Geoffrey Brock, and it's in a Faber anthology of Italian poetry edited by Jamie McKendrick. And in those editions, though, it doesn't say goodbye limed arena, it says goodbye limed sand, which was the word that I found when I translated this way back in about 1992.
My main contribution to the poem.
Yes, this is Roberta's contribution, so I'll hand over to her. Roberta thought that this was, because this is set in Rome, it's probably a reference to the Colosseo.
Yeah,
or something like that.
Yeah, because arena has a double meaning in Italian, but I didn't think that sand was...
It's a kind of dictionary
translation. Yeah, and because it was a saluto a Roma, addio diamante, that there is the shape of the Colosseum.
So that's why it says arena there.
Yeah.
So in other words, the translation here the decision was to not translate it. And the only other thing we wanted to mention is, I think this is a kind of happy thing. One of the things that's happy about this is I think I managed to get it to rhyme in a way that, although it's not the same as the Italian, it does resemble it quite closely. But obviously, in order to do that, you've got to be a little bit free, so that vento and lamento is in the singular here. So I've done it in the plural with gales and whales. So you get a rhyme. It's quite close in the sense.
It is probably even better than the Italian, because it's true. Sometimes translation, not only guarantees the survival of poetry, but also sometimes the translation is even better. In this case, I think that vento lamento is it's kind of a
standard rhyme, isn't it?
Standard rhyme, yes, when it's not in English. So good, bravo.
Thank you. Very kind of you. Occasionally you can manage to get something.
So now let's go to one of the epitaphs, our Rolls Royce. That's it's I think that's something, when you heard us reading, you probably were aware of the rhythm of this poem, and where, there are these very, very strong enjambements, and that in English we couldn't always maintain because of the different rhythm and, the different choice of words.
And also the different word order. In English and Italian have different word order, so you can't always get the translation of his word at the end of the line ending. So you've got to be a little bit free with where the line endings come, but at the same time to try and respect the formal idea of these poems, where I think, as you can see, that up here at the top here, we've got the word cupi cristalli forse una rolls. So the word rolls is just sitting there in the middle of the line. Very, very hard to do that in English, I think, because after all, una is a lovely word, isn't it, with a couple of syllables, with a nice cadence in it and so on, whereas is just a kind of a little sort of dead noise in English, isn't it? Very difficult.
Yeah, and the same example is here, dal portone numero 1, from the front door at number 1 that we decided to.
So in both cases, I've slightly adjusted the enjambment. In the English case, I put the article down onto the next line. And in this case here, we've actually...
This is interesting, yes.
This has got almost the same number of syllables.
Dal portone
numero 1, from the front door at number 1. It's almost exactly the same number of syllables. I've got 4 and 4. He's got, I think, 9, but his runs over like this with, again, uno, like una, uno, it's got this lovely shape to it, whereas 1 is just very, again, the poem would kind of stop dead in English, I think, if it just had the line 1. But if you put, these are the
also you have 4 words here, so from the front door, you don't have one word to say portone.
Exactly.
So, it would be too long here. So, we had to make decision like that. But I think that even reading in English, it was as beautiful as the Italian.
One of the reasons is because, the big challenge in the early poetry, the rhythmical unit is basically the line.
Okay.
We've got the strong rhymes at the ends, sometimes a strong enjambment, but you've got actually rather traditional metrical units, Italian metrical units. Here, the rhythmical
senza.
unit is really kind of like the paragraph. So you've got to kind of get a lot of cantabile. You've got to get a lot of sort of singing through the lines in order to get it to be rhythmical. It's a different writing challenge altogether.
And also, words like, for example, mamma, which seems like a rather easy word to translate. I don't think we always translate in the same way. But
we had the problem with mom and mum as well, because
of the
English and the American different versions. And with mama, should you put mum or... So we went for a slightly more traditional...
Mother, which in English is less formal, right, than in Italian. You can call your mother mother, right? You wouldn't say madre in Italian.
I wouldn't, but you can,
Okay.
Yeah.
So...
One of my brothers calls my mum mother, and I always think it feels a little bit
but nobody in Italy does it, though. So.
No.
Exactly.
It's a noun, isn't it?
Yeah, it's a noun.
So you can't do that.
Or you want it to be very, very formal. So, per lettera, Rolls Royce. This one. This one is also...
So this is a tiny example of the way in which, although you can't always translate the literary echoes of the original, because the people in the other language just won't hear them. If you translate something where you've got a Dantescan allusion, and you very carefully reproduce this Dantescan allusion in English, well, there is no allusion in English because these phrases are not known in the same way. So one of the things you can do is you can allow your knowledge of the literature of the other language to just inflect your translation a bit. And when I came across non sbaglia mai, if you just translate that kind of quite literally, you get something like never wrong. And if you say never wrong in English, well, if you're me anyway, you can't help thinking of the beginning of W.H. Auden's great poem, The Musée des Beaux-Arts, about suffering they were never wrong, the old masters.
Oh, it's always beautiful.
So you can just drop this kind of thing in, and maybe people won't notice it, but it's there.
But Bassani could have this in mind as well, because he was a reader of Auden. So
they probably met.
Yeah.
After all, Auden spent so much time in Italy at that time.
And okay, so those were a few practical examples, and also we would like to, as a conclusion of our presentation, to point out that to translate needs a village. So it's not only Peter and I, but we had the help of other people. And when we were seriously lost, we asked. So that's an example.
We have 3 examples of this.
We have 3 examples of this. The first one is We had the help of Anna Dolfi, who is one of the major scholars of Bassani in Italy, and she just published 2021, I think,
Maybe.
a critical edition of all the poems. And so you can see that the poem finishes abruptly, like d'assai più, si vede? Non si vede.
Assai più lungo
o magari da chi
la
defunto
pena.
d'assai più lungo tempo la pena. And it's not something that Bassani would ever do. There is not one single example of a poem that abruptly ends like that. But Peter and I, for some reason, I couldn't understand. So we asked Anna Dolfi, who was very happy to give us the solution that does for the recently per la pena morto, or maybe of one who died a much longer time does so for the recently dead.
The recently deceased.
It's
or
just
something
implied,
like that, yeah.
but we couldn't see it, So, and another example.
So this was one where we were translating it, but we couldn't even work out what the translation meant. Never mind the original.
So the first translation was really disastrous. This stanza was ending in a way that nobody could believe that Bassani could write something like that. And this is another example, very interesting actually, where we had the help of a very young scholar who is is responsible at the Fondazione Bassani in Ferrara, Marcello Azzi. Okay, so you see in that our edition of this poem, where this verse, this line is repeated twice. Quello storto amico sale con quello storto amico tabalgico, etc. And it was very, very weird. We couldn't understand why he was repeating the line, and what this sale was it climbing, was salt, we were completely lost.
We even wondered if it might be like sal macaroni in the poem of Serenis, so this could be French.
We came out with, I don't know how many solutions. That was our Meridiano edition, so and Marcello had another edition. We asked him, the same as Meridiano.
Well, we were actually standing in the street outside Bassani's house in Ferrara, and we were being taken on a tour by Marcello, and I think I started talking about this problem bit, and Marcello had his edition of the Meridiani with him, so he looked it up.
And he said, no, it's not. It's con quella zazzera genialoide, pepe e sale. So now all of a sudden this sale made sense. Pepe e sale, come in inglese, pepper.
Salt and pepper.
Salt and pepper, mop of air. Okay, now it makes sense. And we found this edition. This is the first edition of Epitaph.
It's Epitaphio.
Epitaphio. And you see this is an autograph correction by Bassani. And so probably they made a second edition where they corrected the mistake. But
then the editors of the Meridiani went back to the original first edition and reprinted the
mistake.
Error.
Yes.
And then Anna Dolfi, I'm going to say this, Anna Dolfi, she reprinted the mistake as well.
So there is no mistake, Luigi, in this
But
edition.
this one has the correct text in it. Thanks to Marcello.
And last example of something that didn't make me sleep, I thought about this forever and ever. I dreamed of this word, which is the word pidaz here. So Bassani is talking to a professor of philosophy. Actually, I don't know if maybe we don't know who's this professor is.
But he's a professor who worked for a long time in America, obviously.
Yeah, it doesn't really matter, but because the word we are interesting here is pidaz. So again, we asked Ferrarese people from Ferrara asking what this pidaz meant big foot from the dialect piede, maybe was soccer player because of the pidaz, and we couldn't really, make it up. And then we checked because Bassani has always revised his works more than once. So his books and short stories have different versions circulating. So we went and checked one of the first, probably the first version of this not this poem actually, but one of his short stories contained the same thing. He was talking about a friend who was ex-Pidaz. But instead of using Pidaz, he used the word party, partito. So I said, partito. So I said, okay, let me check what Weaver did. And Weaver translated from that, from that...
translated from the first edition
of that short story.
Yeah.
And then it translated with action party, partito d'azione. So the puzzle was solved is
so Pidaz is a kind of shortening.
P-D-Az, partito d'azione.
Partito d'azione.
So,
And Bassani was a member of this party from 1942, and it kind of dissolved in the post-war period.
Yeah, it was an anti-fascist party that, was founded in 42, I think, and Bassani belonged to it. So, in our first idea was to leave Pidaz alone, but it's always very depressing for a translator to leave things alone because you haven't understood them, so... Yeah.
Ex partito d'azione. So we didn't translate it, but we did make it clear what it is.
We didn't translate action party because we thought it was a little
action
weird.
Party sounds weird.
Yeah. Okay, I think.
Well, that's what we have
to
say.
That's our contribution.
So if I don't know. I don't know if maybe we have time for some questions or something like this.
Before we start with the question, I just want to remind you that we have copies of the book upstairs. Very special price tonight, courtesy of Agincourt Press. So only $20, cash only, if you want to buy a copy upstairs before you leave. And we have time now for a couple of questions. Yes.
Thank you very much for a most instructive lecture. It's fascinating. I have many questions, but I'll try and limit it to number one. Would you say he had influences, poetic influences? And before you answer that, does his poetry reflect the Jewish and anti-fascist sentiments that we think of when we think of Bassani and the garden? Thank you.
Yeah, difficult.
Which one do you want to do? We could do one each.
Yeah. Go.
Well, for influences, I think obviously the two types of poetry he wrote are so very, very different. And if you think about the early poetry, I think you can see the way that he's being influenced by writers who were then either emerging or who were established. So there are echoes of Umberto Saba, I think, in some of these early poems there, and I think Vittorio Sereni's Frontiera, which had come out in 1941, the year before he starts writing all these poems. I think you can hear echoes of that in it. I think maybe even some of Antonia Pozzi's poetry. Another possibility, though, is that they're just all operating within the same lexical field, sort of late 1930s, post-Hermeticist poetry.
And also,
would he have been reading poetry in English? So any English?
In English
he
poetry?
Did, yes,
yeah,
he did.
Yeah,
yes, he did.
Hardy, people like that,
yes,
I think maybe.
He did. And also maybe also the influence of the Italian sonnet for the first poems. Many of the poems have a structure that is not always a sonnet, but resembles to it, and a lot of Dante, of course, a lot of Dante.
But there's also, she appears in the Garden of the Finzi-Continis, so he probably read Emily Dickinson.
Yes.
So the quatrain poems of Emily Dickinson.
Yeah, that's one of his, because he was also a translator, not a very prolific translator actually, but he did.
Actually, he translated Robert Louis Stevenson poetry.
Beautiful.
Too,
his translation of that poem is The Starry Night is gorgeous, very, very nice translation. And also in the Giardino dei Finzi-Contini there are some examples of him as a poet. So his character, which is not Giorgio Bassani, but use the word I, and doesn't have a name. And he's a fictional character, even though you can recognize him.
I think he mentions Ungaretti and Montale.
Ungaretti, Montale, yeah.
So with the later poetry, though, something completely different, isn't it? And I think the impact of American beat poetry is kind of pretty clear. There was a beat poet called Michael McClure who did this centering all of his lines. And in fact, Paola Bassani has written an essay which appears, we use it as a preface to the book here, where she talks about the idea that these poems, these late poems, are inspired by pop art.
By pop art. Somebody told me that was not convinced. Was you, Alessandro?
You're not convinced by that?
No, not at all.
Really. I'm not very much, but but surely the American culture of the 1960s is in these later poems, and the frankness,
but also
and the autobiographism as well, the confessional autobiographical style.
Yeah. And Lars Montale also, wrote in this kind of way.
Well, that late Montale, he started to write like that.
So it was not by himself, alone. As for your second question, I'm not sure if I know how to respond.
Well, there are in the late poems. There are ones. There's one called
yes.
to the ex-fascists of Ferrara, or something like that, isn't there? So that some of the feelings and ideas that are in the fiction appear quite overtly as opinions, really, or attitudes, or views in the late poetry.
Yeah,
so
if you read the book, there are a couple of poems very strong and very moving about the fact that, people in Ferrara behaved exactly the same way after the war, kind of forgetting what they did with the racial laws. And Bassani is very, very
extremely
angry about that. Mm. But the way Bassani does is not always. Is subtle, is never, you have to look for those things in his poems and they emerge.
The other thing you could say is that in the later in the post-war poems, the early ones, the ones written after 1945 and before 1952, you can see emerging in those poems a feeling of what you might call survivor guilt. His awareness of the Holocaust and his awareness that he survived it appears in these late.
There is an incredible short story called Una lapide in via Mazzini in the Storie Ferraresi, where there is a survivor, the story of Geo Yods, that is to me is one of the most strong stories about being a survivor. And
one more. In the poem about Detroit, cats and mice and butts, what kind of butts are we talking about there?
Cigarette butts.
Cigarette
butts,
yeah.
okay.
Cigarettes.
Yeah.
But
interesting problem, yes.
Yes.
Could be something else.
Could be. There is a couple of poems where really, could be. Michael. Yes, the prince.
Oh, wow.
Ciao, Michael.
Hello.
Ciao, complimenti, but I'm not going to ask a question about translation. What about biography, which I wouldn't normally, because I think you kind of gave short shrift to his life in your presentation. I mean, I wonder when he found time to write. I mean, when he was in Rome, he was taking a bus out to teach at a middle school. He was writing screenplays for Cinecittà. He was writing novels. I mean, did he write these poems on the bus ride or something? I mean, it's sort of remarkable to think of how productive he was.
I think he didn't write them.
No,
as far as I know, what happened was that he, in the late 40s, he kind of stops writing poetry. And then there's no poetry at all until after he's finished
after 72. Actually, there is like a big. I don't think he didn't write at all, but mostly. He wrote
maybe
some of these later poems were lying around for longer.
I mean, he was struggling to make a living, right?
Of course, of course.
But I think the publishing career probably represents or reflects the writing life as well. So poetry, and then the prose, and then these late poems.
Yeah, and then
when he was writing fiction. So he's kind of like James Joyce and Thomas Hardy at the same time. So first of all, he writes poetry, and then he writes fiction, and then he gives up fiction and he writes poetry.
I sort of like the image of him writing poems on this bus ride into the
Well, that's
Roman countryside.
also possible.
I don't know.
If there are no other questions, we thank our. We have one. Thank you so much.
Thank you.